India's undisputed new leader, fresh from a thundering mandate to lead. The other, India's newest, largest and most formidable warship. And now, the twain shall meet. If size matters for the Navy's 45,000-ton INS Vikramaditya, it couldn't get bigger than this. On Saturday, the floating airfield will welcome on board its biggest guest yet, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, for a ceremonial demonstration of raw maritime power. But not long ago, before the ship made its amazing journey from freezing Russia to the Indian tropics, Headlines Today was the first news crew to report from her deck. She's nearly twice the size of India's current biggest warship. She has spent nearly a decade literally being turned inside out at this remote facility in northeastern Russia. Her lumbering journey into the Indian Navy's hands has spanned 3 government tenures, enormous intrigue and a great deal of controversy. But now she's ready to do what she was built to. Today I stand on her deck to bring you this, the story of INS Vikramaditya. On a freezing, snow-blown November morning far from Indian shores, an old Russian relic became the Navy's newest born. As the national anthem wafted through the bitterly cold northern winds, the Vikramaditya's new identity flapped in the wind. In over half a century of modern seafaring, the Indian Navy hasn't operated anything a fraction as complex as the Vikramaditya. She dwarfs India's erstwhile flagship INS Virat and promises to allow an ambitious but hamstrung navy to venture farther and deeper into international waters than ever before. But along with its enormous bulk and the 1,600 personnel it will take to operate her on the high seas, the Vikramaditya comes with the big burden of history. For one thing, Vikramaditya is this ship's third name. She was originally commissioned into the Russian Navy as Baku in 1987, then renamed after naval pioneer Admiral Sergei Georgievich Gorshkov when the Soviet Union collapsed 4 years later. She may look spanking new today, and in many ways she truly is, but her journey into Indian hands began 2 decades ago. In 1994, P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was both Prime Minister and Defence Minister at the time, was offered the Soviet-era Admiral Gorshkov aviation cruiser. The Indian Navy was immediately interested. But in the turbulent few years that followed politically in Delhi, the offer receded to the notorious Indian back burner. The first of many delays that would plague Project 11430, as it was codenamed. When the offer was back on the table, it was just before India went to war. In 1999, shortly after the Kargil War, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government was offered a little-known Russian warship that had been rotting in its dock for more than a decade. Russia said, "The Admiral Gorshkov is yours for free. All you need to do is pay for repairs and re-equipment." In the best traditions of India's notoriously slow decision-making when it comes to defense, it took nearly 5 years for India to sign on the dotted line. In July 1999, the ship was towed to Sverodvinsk, a Russian Cold War era shipbuilding town famous as the site for the country's only manufacturer of nuclear submarines, Sevmash. After a decade of negotiations, the elusive contract was signed on the 20th of January 2004 in the presence of then Defense Minister George Fernandez and his visiting Russian counterpart Sergei Ivanov. It was the biggest defense deal thus far between the two old allies. By the end of that year, work had begun in earnest to transform a rusting heap of forgotten metal into the shining aircraft carrier that the Indian Navy had been promised. But as the first Russian engineers entered the insides of the great ship, they reeled in horror. A close inspection of the Gorshkov showed that she would never be repaired and refurbished in the promised 52 months. Russia, a veteran shipbuilder, and India, with its painstaking attention to detail, had managed to stunningly underestimate the scope of work involved. An aircraft carrier is so big, so enormously stable that rough seas usually don't matter much to the crew on board. But the Gorshkov, which India had named Vikramaditya, happened to hit turbulence like it had perhaps never experienced before, and this before she had even left her dock. When work began on the Admiral Gorshkov, and remember the ship had been stagnating for nearly a decade, its insides had literally begun to rust and rot. This was no warship. It was a great heap of mostly useless metal. The numbers that began to jump out at the engineers made their heads spin. 2,300 kilometers of cables, 3,000 kilometers of pipes, modifications of 1,750 out of 2,500 compartments, 234 new hull sections fabricated from 2,500 tons of steel. Thousands of motors, turbines and boilers had to be completely replaced, and this was just the beginning. The magnitude of the miscalculation gave the Indian Navy that terrible sinking feeling. The project was more colossal than it could have ever imagined. The old warship needed to be modified to cater for an all-new flight deck with arrestor wires, a full modification of its bulbous bow, huge aircraft lifts that would lead to a hangar for its fighter jets, brand new main boilers and diesel generators, the complete replacement of existing distilling plants, the fitment of reverse osmosis plants for clean water on board, and a fully new air conditioning and refrigeration plant. And this was before the Russian team could even think of giving the Gorshkov modern combat systems that would make it a true fighting ship. Realizing just how much the scope of work on the massive warship had actually been underestimated by both sides came as a terrible shock to the Indian Navy. The cost of the ship more than doubled to nearly $2.5 billion, more than the cost. It was the shattering delay of 5 years that seriously made things very hot for the Indian Navy. The incredibly over-optimistic time frame threw everything out of gear. Work on the Gorshkov ground nearly to a halt. A desperate Indian government, which had already begun paying for the program, knew that there was no backing out without inflicting irreversible damage to bilateral relations. Both sides sat down once again for a seemingly endless renegotiation of the original $947 million deal. Finally, in December 2009, over 5 years after the original deal was signed and a full year after the ship was originally to be delivered, India and Russia agreed on a fresh price, $2.34 billion, a painful cost escalation of more than 2.5 times. More importantly, India agreed to Russia's pledge that it would deliver the ship only in 2012, more than 4 years later than agreed upon in the original 2004 contract. Away from the windswept deck of the woefully incomplete ship, behind closed doors, the turbulence of negotiations between 2007 and 2009 very nearly sank the entire program. It is only now that we know how dangerously close things came to collapsing completely. The Indian Navy had no choice but to swallow hard and sail on. Its patience and resilience, fortunately, was rewarded. Slowly, very slowly, the promised transformation took place. Piece by painful piece, the old Admiral Gorshkov shed its skin to gradually reveal a ship that was by all accounts impressive and formidable. With baby steps that spanned over 2 years, the Russian and Indian teams finally mustered the confidence to push the new behemoth out to sea on her own steam. At midday on the 10th of June 2012, after 17 years, the erstwhile Admiral Gorshkov, now officially designated Vikramaditya, sailed for the first time on her very own power. It was a rare psychological boost for a program that had spent years with shattered morale. Only the Indian Navy could truly appreciate what the emergence of the Vikramaditya really meant. With the retirement of INS Vikrant, India's first aircraft carrier in 1997, the Navy bade farewell to a decade of operations with 2 aircraft carriers, an ideal number in the Navy's warfighting doctrine, allowing it to deploy 1 aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea and the other in the Bay of Bengal. The Vikramaditya's arrival heralds a return to that regime. After operating a single aircraft carrier for over 16 years, the Indian Navy is once again technically a 2-carrier force. The aging INS Virat, which has sailed for over 50 years, now has very welcome company. India's sole operational aircraft carrier, INS Virat, is, quite frankly, on her last legs. A veteran of the Falklands War in the South Atlantic, the Virat is an exceptional vessel. But with her embedded fleet of Sea Harrier jump jets no longer packing the punch they once used to, the Navy knows that the Virat is only a shadow of the formidable presence she once was. Even so, the Indian Navy hopes to push the old British warhorse and keep her in service till the end of this decade. Or at least until India's first fully home-built aircraft carrier, the new generation Vikrant, is ready to join the Indian Navy. By that time, the Navy would have had a chance to open up the Vikramaditya in open ocean and discover what she's truly capable of. Few know that the last 18 months before the Vikramaditya flew the Indian flag were nerve-wracking, stormy, and replete with dangerous turmoil. When we return, we tell you the untold story of just what the Vikramaditya had to be put through to finally prove worthy of the Indian Navy. Operating from Karwar on the west coast, the heart of Vikramaditya's potency will be a formidable unit positioned just north in Goa. As an aircraft carrier, remember, Vikramaditya is nothing without its floating fleet of fighter aircraft. In June 2012, the first of many jet fighters blasted off the modified deck of Vikramaditya. The first of 42 missions that would demonstrate the aircraft carrier for its spectacular new role. But just as things were getting up to speed, there was an incident far out in the Barents Sea that created a major stir on board. The vulnerable Vikramaditya was spied upon by NATO forces. These images show a NATO maritime reconnaissance aircraft snooping on the warship in an attempt to harvest classified electronic and acoustic data. The Russians tried to take up the intrusion diplomatically, but in a spy game, few things can ever be taken to their logical conclusion. At any rate, the Vikramaditya was in a race against time. In a few months, she needed to be ready for the Indian Navy. Then suddenly, in September 2012, unexpectedly, disaster struck. 7 out of the Vikramaditya's 8 massive boilers broke down and collapsed when they were pushed to maximum load and power. It was a body blow to a project that had finally begun to turn the corner, and it meant that the ship had to limp back to its dock, not just for repairs, but an entirely new insulation system to withstand the enormous heat of the boilers. For the Navy, this was dreadful news. It meant at least another year's delay. It took 8 agonizing months for the necessary repairs and modifications. With no luxury of time, and given that the boiler unit on board the ship is fully sealed, the Navy approved the use of asbestos cardboard for the insulation of the steel casing housing the boilers, a difficult choice given the known harmful effects of the material. Things rapidly picked up pace after that, when the ship was sent out to sea again for what both sides hoped would be her final trials. Thankfully, they were. The Vikramaditya is big enough to deploy 30 aircraft in a mix of MiG-29K fighter jets, Kamov anti-submarine and early warning helicopters, and Sea King multi-mission helicopters. This, of course, is in addition to onboard weapons. But these are the Vikramaditya's real teeth. Aircraft that provide a legacy jump for the Indian Navy's ability to strike far from Indian shores. With ranges of 700 nautical miles without refueling, the MiG-29K brings to bear formidable weaponry, including beyond visual range air-to-air missiles, guided bombs, anti-ship weapons and rockets. In 2010, as if to underscore the big delays, the ship's embedded fighter fleet began arriving in India. The MiG-29K multi-role jets, built to operate off the aircraft carrier's modified flight deck, would spend the next 3 years without their mothership, instead flying conventional training missions from the INS Hansa airbase in Goa. The Indian Navy has waited so long for the Vikramaditya, it has actually used the ship in its dreams. Over the last 5 years, a phantom Vikramaditya has sprung up in war games and simulated situations in the Indian Ocean. With the real ship now flying with an Indian flag, the Indian Navy cannot wait to open her up in the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Navy today, there's a sense of disbelief that the long wait for Vikramaditya is finally over. After 2 decades, the anxiety, suspense and generous amounts of pain abruptly at an end. In 2014, the Vikramaditya will be part of internal exercises in both the Arabian Sea as well as the Bay of Bengal. Her presence in the Indian Ocean will already be a hefty message. But it won't be until at least 2015 that the Navy fields the Vikramaditya in exercises with other countries. It will take a year at least for her crew to fully understand her and be confident enough to show her off. The Vikramaditya may be dwarfed by the enormous American supercarriers that prowl all corners of the world's oceans, but it is a formidable platform that gives India a serious edge over China. That's still taking baby steps to deploy its own floating airfield. A conventional maritime battle is thankfully a remote possibility, and the Vikramaditya will have its role in ensuring that. The Indian Navy has far fewer ships than China's maritime force. The Indian Navy has always wondered about the People's Liberation Army Navy's long-term intentions in the Indian Ocean region and its rapid force build-up. But the Vikramaditya's arrival in the Indian Ocean will serve to underscore China's conspicuous lack of a similar capability. Unlike India, which has operated aircraft carriers for decades, China has deployed the refurbished Russian Varyag aircraft carrier as the modernized Liaoning, but not for operations. China, like India, is attempting to build its own. Till that time though, the Vikramaditya provides India an enormous psychological and operational edge in the Indian Ocean. One that it won't ever want to lose. As the Indian Navy begins to discover what the INS Vikramaditya can do, the 45,000-ton beast leaves great churning in its wake. As we sign off from the deck of this phenomenal feat of marine engineering and warcraft, let's hope Vikramaditya allows its new nation to sleep a little better at night. And as they say in the Indian Navy, may Varuna, the Lord of the Oceans, be auspicious unto those who set sail.